There are moments in life when you realize that loyalty isn't something you teach. It's something that lives in the bones, in the blood, in the silent spaces between heartbeats. And for Master Sergeant David Chen, that realization came not from his years of combat training, not from the brothers he served alongside in the most dangerous corners of the earth, but from a 13-pound orange tabby cat named Radar, who understood something about war that most humans never could. Every time David packed his duffel bag, every time he laced up his boots in that particular way that meant he wasn't just going to the base for training, every time the house fell into that heavy silence that precedes a long goodbye, Radar would disappear, not in the way cats usually do when they're annoyed or seeking solitude, but in a way that seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if he knew something terrible was coming and he needed to prepare. And what he did in those final hours before each deployment, what he did 11 times over the course of 14 years, would become a mystery that haunted David through firefights in Fallujah, through casualty collection points in Kandahar, through the screaming chaos of field hospitals where he held together bodies that wanted to fall apart. And it wasn't until the 11th deployment, until the moment he thought would be his last, that he finally understood what Radar had been doing all along. And when he understood, when the pieces finally came together in a way that defied everything he knew about animals and intuition and the thin membrane between this world and whatever lies beyond it, he wept in a way he never had before, not for the soldiers he couldn't save, not for the pieces of himself he left scattered across 3 continents, but for the creature who had been protecting him in the only way he knew how. If this story moves you, if you've ever wondered about the invisible threads that connect us to the animals we love, subscribe to this channel right now because you're about to hear something that will change the way you think about loyalty, about sacrifice, about the things we cannot see but somehow feel in the marrow of our existence. Hit that like button if you believe some bonds transcend explanation, and drop a comment telling me what city, what country you're watching from. Because this story belongs to everyone who has ever loved something enough to let it break their heart. David Chen became a combat medic not because he wanted to be a hero, not because he craved the adrenaline or the medals or the respect that comes with saving lives under fire, but because his older brother Marcus died in a car accident when David was 17, bled out on a highway while bystanders watched and waited for ambulances that arrived too late. And David decided in that moment, standing over a closed casket at a funeral where everyone kept saying, God's plan and better place, and all the hollow words people used to paper over the obscenity of a young life ended, that he would never again be helpless while someone died in front of him. So he enlisted the day after his 18th birthday, went through medic training with a focus that bordered on obsession. And by the time he was 22, he had seen more death than most people see in a lifetime, had held pressure on wounds that fountained blood like accusations, had whispered lies about everything being okay to teenagers who would be dead in minutes. And through it all, through the deployments that blurred together into one long nightmare, punctuated by brief returns to a country that felt more foreign than the war zones, the one constant, the one thing that kept him tethered to something resembling sanity, was Radar. He found the cat on his first trip back from Iraq, found him in a cardboard box behind a veterinary clinic that was closing for the day, a tiny orange kitten with eyes that seemed too large for his head, and a cry that sounded almost human in its desperation. And David, who had spent the previous 8 months trying to save lives in a place where death arrived in 1,000 creative ways, couldn't walk past that box, couldn't ignore that sound. So he picked up the kitten and felt its heartbeat against his palm. Rapid and fragile, and somehow defiant. And he thought about all the heartbeats he had felt stop, all the pulses that faded under his fingers despite everything he knew, despite all his training and skill and desperate bargaining with a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. And he made a decision that seemed small at the time, but would become the axis around which the next 14 years of his life would rotate. He named the cat Radar because of those oversized eyes, because of the way the kitten seemed to track movement before it happened, seemed to sense things that hadn't yet occurred, And in those first few months back in the States, living in a small apartment near the base where he trained between deployments, Radar became the only living thing David could talk to about the things he had seen. The only presence that didn't flinch when he woke up screaming, didn't ask questions he couldn't answer, didn't offer sympathy that felt like pity. And the cat would sit on his chest in the dark hours after the nightmares, purring in a frequency that seemed to match David's heartbeat, seemed to slow the racing panic that followed him out of sleep. And David began to understand that he had not rescued this animal. This animal had somehow rescued him. The first deployment after finding Radar came 6 months later, and David approached it the way he approached all of them, with a kind of resigned fatalism, with his affairs in order and his gear checked and rechecked, and a will that he updated before every trip. And he asked his neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in the building for 30 years and seemed to know everyone's business, if she would feed the cat while he was gone. And she agreed with the kind of matter-of-fact kindness that military towns specialize in. And David spent his last day at home doing laundry and cleaning his rifle and trying not to think about all the ways he might die in the next 7 months. And that's when he noticed that Radar had disappeared. He searched the apartment, called the cat's name, checked all the usual hiding spots, the space behind the water heater, the top shelf of the closet, the gap between the refrigerator and the wall. But Radar was nowhere. And David felt a spike of panic that seemed disproportionate, felt an unreasonable certainty that something terrible had happened. And he was about to start knocking on neighbors' doors when he heard it, a sound coming from his bedroom, a strange rhythmic scratching that made his combat-trained instincts flare with alarm. He pushed open the bedroom door slowly, the way you open doors in buildings that might contain threats. And what he saw made him stop completely. Made him question whether the stress of pre-deployment was causing hallucinations, because Radar was in the closet, was pulling David's clothes off hangers with a determination that seemed almost frantic, was dragging shirts and pants and socks into a pile in the corner, and the pile was growing, was becoming a nest of fabric that smelled like David, like home, like all the mundane safety of a life that didn't include roadside bombs and arterial bleeds. And David watched this for several minutes, watched his cat work with singular focus. And he felt something crack open in his chest, felt some understanding hovering just beyond his ability to articulate it. But he didn't interfere, didn't try to stop this strange behavior. And when Radar finally finished, when the pile was complete, the cat climbed into the center of it and closed his eyes and began to purr. And David sat on the floor next to the closet and wondered what the hell he was witnessing. He deployed the next morning, left Mrs. Patterson with instructions and emergency numbers and far too much money for cat food. And he thought about Radar's nest during the flight to Kuwait, during the convoy north into Iraq, during the long days that followed where time moved in strange ways, stretched out during the boring hours of waiting, and compressed into frantic seconds when the casualties came in. And he wrote letters home that he never sent. Letters where he tried to explain to people who weren't there why the image of a cat making a nest out of his clothes kept appearing in his mind during the worst moments. Why that memory somehow steadied him when everything else was chaos. And he survived that deployment the way he survived all of them, through a combination of skill and luck and a kind of mechanical dissociation that let him function while part of his mind went somewhere else, somewhere safer. When he came home 7 months later, when he opened his apartment door and dropped his duffel in the entryway and stood in the sudden silence of a space that felt both familiar and alien, Radar appeared from the bedroom, walked toward him with that particular cat swagger that suggests they're doing you a favor by acknowledging your existence. And David picked him up and held him close and felt the purring vibration against his ribs. And later, when he went into the bedroom to unpack, he found the nest still there in the closet, found it exactly as Radar had made it. And the clothes were matted with cat hair and smelled stale and somehow sacred. And David understood without being told that Radar had spent the deployment in that nest, had rarely left it, had curled into David's scent the way David had curled into memories of home during the long nights on base. And he sat on the floor again, sat in the same spot where he had watched Radar build this thing. And he cried for the first time since Marcus died. Cried in a way that felt like something essential breaking loose. The pattern repeated with the second deployment. Radar disappeared the day before David left. Was found hours later in the closet making another nest. Pulling fresh clothes from hangers with the same urgent determination. And this time David didn't question it. Didn't try to rationalize or explain. He simply watched. And before he left the next morning, he added one of his worn t-shirts to the pile. The one he had slept in the night before, and he told Radar out loud. Told him in words that felt ridiculous and necessary. "I'll come back. I promise I'll come back." And the cat looked at him with those enormous eyes that had earned him his name, and David felt certain. Felt it in a way that transcended logic, that Radar understood not just the words but the weight behind them. The desperate prayer hidden in a simple promise. The deployments came faster after that. The wars were expanding in ways that devoured medics, that needed bodies trained to keep other bodies alive. And David went to Afghanistan, went back to Iraq, went to places that weren't officially wars, but had all the characteristics of war. The fear and the blood and the way time moved differently when death was a constant possibility. And every single time, every single deployment over the next 12 years, Radar performed the same ritual, disappeared the day before David left, built a nest in the closet, and David would find him there, curled into fabric and scent and some kind of faith that defied David's understanding of what animals could comprehend. Mrs. Patterson, who continued to watch Radar through all of this, told David after the third deployment that the cat barely ate while he was gone, would leave the nest only to use the litter box and take a few reluctant bites of food before returning to the closet. And she said it in a way that suggested she thought David should maybe reconsider his career, should maybe think about what he was doing to this animal. And David wanted to explain that he was thinking about it constantly, was carrying the weight of Radar's vigil with him through every mission, every casualty, every moment when he had to make decisions about who lived and who died based on calculations that reduced human beings to triage categories. But he didn't know how to say any of that, didn't know how to explain that Radar's ritual had become a kind of anchor. A reminder that somewhere in the world, something was waiting for him with a loyalty so pure it bordered on holy. By the 9th deployment, David was 34 years old and felt 60. Had joints that ached from carrying heavy packs through rough terrain. Had hands that shook sometimes when he tried to thread a needle or start in 4. Had a collection of memories that played on loop during the nights when sleep wouldn't come. And he thought about leaving, thought about finishing his contract and walking away. Thought about finding some civilian job where the worst thing that could happen was a PowerPoint presentation running long. But he kept re-enlisting because he was good at what he did. Because he had saved lives that would have been lost without him. Because he didn't know how to be anything other than what he had become. And because every time he came home, Radar was there, was always there, waiting in that nest like a guardian of something David couldn't name. The 10th deployment was supposed to be routine. Was supposed to be a 6-month stint training Afghan National Army medics. A deployment where he would mostly be on a base, mostly be teaching rather than doing. And David felt something like relief when he got the orders. Felt like maybe this would be easier. Maybe this would be the one where he didn't have to hold someone's hand while they died. And he watched Radar build the nest for the 10th time, and he added 3 shirts this time. 3 of his favorites, and he told the cat the same words he always did. "I'll come back. I promise I'll come back." And he believed it more than usual, believed that this deployment would be different. But the 10th deployment was not different. The 10th deployment was the one where David learned there is no such thing as routine in a war zone. Learned it when a vehicle-borne IED detonated 50 meters from the training area. Learned It when the blast wave knocked him off his feet and filled the air with smoke and screaming and the particular smell of burning that he had learned to associate with death. And he was up before he consciously decided to move, was running toward the casualties with his aid bag, was falling into the rhythm that had been drilled into him through repetition and necessity. And there were so many wounded, so many bodies with missing pieces. And David worked with the efficiency of a machine, worked through the chaos applying tourniquets and chest seals and pressure bandages, worked until his hands were red and his uniform was soaked and his ears were ringing from the blast and the shouting. And it wasn't until he was in the shower trying to wash blood out of his hair, that he started shaking, started feeling the delayed reaction that his body had suppressed in order to function. And he thought about radar in that moment, thought about the nest waiting in a closet 6,000 miles away, and the thought steadied him the way it always did, gave him something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was dissolving. He finished the deployment, came home in one piece physically, if not entirely mentally, and found radar waiting exactly where he expected, and the relief he felt seeing that orange face, seeing those oversized eyes tracking his movement, was so intense it made him dizzy, made him sit down hard on the floor while radar climbed into his lap and purred and kneaded his chest with paws that still smelled faintly like the clothes from the nest. And David held him and whispered thank you, whispered it over and over like a prayer or a confession, and he meant it in ways he couldn't fully articulate, meant thank you for waiting, thank you for believing I would come back, thank you for giving me a reason to come back. The 11th deployment came 8 months later. Came with orders that made David's stomach drop, because this one was different in a way that all the others hadn't been. This one was Helmand Province, Afghanistan. This one was a place where the casualty rates for medics were significantly higher than average. And David knew the statistics, knew that combat medics died at rates disproportionate to other specialties, because they ran toward danger when everyone else's training told them to take cover. And he had accepted that risk 10 times before. But something about this 11th time felt different, felt weighted with a certainty that he couldn't shake, and when he started packing his gear, he did it with the feeling that he was saying goodbye to more than just his apartment. Radar disappeared on schedule, was found in the closet doing what he had done 10 times before. But this time David watched the entire process, sat on the floor and watched every garment get pulled down, watched the nest take shape. And when it was done, he added not just shirts, but his favorite sweater, the one his mother had sent him 3 Christmases ago. The one that was too warm for practical use, but that he kept because it smelled like her kitchen, like cinnamon and safety. And he sat in the closet with radar for a long time, sat there in silence while the cat purred and kneaded the nest into the perfect configuration. And David found himself talking, found himself saying things he had never said out loud, telling radar about Marcus, about the first soldier he couldn't save, about the nightmares and the guilt, and the way he sometimes felt like he was already dead. Like he had died in one of those war zones and everything since was just some kind of epilogue. And radar listened the way cats do, with an attention that feels both complete and inscrutable. And when David finally stood to leave, when he gave radar the same promise he always gave, "I'll come back, I promise I'll come back," the words felt less like a promise and more like a plea. Helmand Province was everything David feared it would be, was a place where violence was constant and creative, where the Taliban used tactics designed to cause maximum casualties, where IEDs were hidden in places that soldiers had no choice but to go, and David treated casualties almost daily. Treated them in dirt fields and burning vehicles, and the backs of helicopters that shook so badly, he could barely hold his instruments steady. And he was good at it, was so good that his team called him Doc Magic, because of the way he seemed to will people back from the edge of death. But there were limits to skill, were injuries so catastrophic that no amount of training could overcome them. And David began to collect ghosts, began to see faces in the dark that belonged to people he couldn't save. And the only thing that kept him functional, the only thought that cut through the growing numbness, was the image of radar in that nest. waiting with a patience that seemed to transcend animal understanding. 4 months into the deployment, David's unit was assigned to provide security and medical support for a village meeting. A routine patrol that everyone knew wasn't routine, because nothing was routine in Helmand. And they were on the road when the shooting started, when the ambush that had been carefully planned and perfectly positioned turned the convoy into a chaos of gunfire and explosions. And David's vehicle took an RPG hit that killed the driver instantly and left David trapped in the wreckage with a piece of shrapnel in his side and blood running into his eyes from a scalp wound he didn't remember receiving. And he could hear screaming, could hear his team calling for him, calling for Doc, and he tried to move but his legs wouldn't respond. Tried to reach for his aid bag, but his arms felt like they belonged to someone else, and he thought with perfect clarity, "This is it, this is how it ends." And his last thought before the darkness started closing in was of radar, was of those enormous eyes and that ridiculous nest and the promise he had made, the promise he was about to break. He woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Germany. Woke up with tubes in his chest and a morphine drip in his arm, and a surgeon telling him that he was incredibly lucky, that the shrapnel had missed his kidney by centimeters, that he would recover fully with time and physical therapy. And David listened to this news with a strange detachment, with a feeling that he had somehow left part of himself back in that burning vehicle, and the first thing he asked, the first words he spoke through a throat raw from intubation, were about his team, and the surgeon's face told him everything he needed to know before the words came. Told him that 2 of his brothers hadn't made it, that he had been pulled from the wreckage by men who were now dead. And David closed his eyes and felt something inside him finally break completely, felt the last piece of whatever had been holding him together give way. They sent him back to the States 2 weeks later. Sent him home on medical leave with a Purple Heart he didn't want and a recommendation for a medical retirement that he knew he would accept because he couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't carry any more ghosts. Couldn't make any more calculations about who lived and who died. And when the plane landed and he made his way through the airport on crutches, when he finally got to his apartment and stood outside the door with his key in his hand, he felt a fear that was worse than anything he had experienced in combat. Felt terrified that radar wouldn't be there, that somehow the cat would know he had failed, had broken his promise by almost dying, and he almost couldn't turn the key, almost couldn't face whatever waited on the other side. But he did turn it, did push the door open, and the apartment was exactly as he had left it. And he called for radar but heard nothing, and the fear intensified. Became a certainty that something terrible had happened. And he moved as quickly as his injuries allowed toward the bedroom, toward the closet, and what he found there stopped him completely. Made him drop his crutches and lower himself awkwardly to the floor, because his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. The nest was still there, was still exactly as radar had made it almost 5 months ago. But it was different now, was changed in a way that made David's breath catch. Because every single piece of clothing was shredded, was torn into strips with a precision that suggested deliberate effort over a long period of time. And in the center of this destruction, in the middle of fabric that had been methodically destroyed, radar lay curled in a tight ball, and he was thin, was visibly thinner than David had ever seen him, and his orange fur was matted and dull. And when David reached out to touch him, the cat's eyes opened and fixed on David's face with an intensity that felt almost accusatory. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway behind him. And she was crying, and she said she was so sorry. Said she had tried everything, said radar had stopped eating completely 3 days after David left. Had stayed in the closet and refused to come out. And she had taken him to the vet twice, and both times they had said there was nothing physically wrong. That this was behavioral, and she had tried force feeding and special foods, and even catnip to tempt him. But nothing worked, and she had been certain the cat would die. Had been preparing herself to call David with the worst news. But then 4 days ago something changed. Radar had started eating again. had started drinking water and using the litter box, had started behaving almost normally except for one thing. Except that every day since then, he had spent hours in the closet shredding those clothes. Shredding them with a focus that seemed almost violent. And Mrs. Patterson didn't understand it, couldn't explain it. And she was saying all of this in a rush of words that David barely heard because he was looking at the shredded fabric and doing the math. Was counting back the days, and he realized with a certainty that made his hands shake that radar had stopped eating the day David's convoy was ambushed, had stopped eating the exact day David nearly died, and had started eating again the day David woke up in Germany, the day he came back to consciousness and decided to live. David reached into his pocket with trembling fingers, pulled out his phone, pulled up the calendar and the deployment log he had kept, and he went through all 11 deployments, went through every date of departure and return, and he asked Mrs. Patterson questions about radar's behavior during each absence. And she remembered because the cat's vigil had always disturbed her, had always seemed too human in its intensity. And what she told him confirmed what David was beginning to understand. Confirmed that during every single deployment, during all 11 times David had gone to war, radar had known. Had somehow known when David was in the most danger, had responded to threats that existed thousands of miles away, and the nest wasn't just a comfort, wasn't just a way to stay close to David's scent, it was something else. Something that suggested a connection that science couldn't explain and David couldn't deny. He looked at the shredded clothes, looked at the way they had been torn into strips that reminded him of bandages, reminded him of the way he tore gauze when he needed to pack a wound quickly. And he thought about the day of the ambush, thought about lying in that wreckage believing he was going to die, and he wondered if somehow, in some way that defied every law of physics and biology he had learned, radar had known, had felt it, had responded by destroying the nest because the nest was built on a promise, on David's promise to come back. And if David died, the promise would be broken and the nest would have no meaning. And so radar had destroyed it, had torn it apart the way David's body had nearly been torn apart. And the symmetry of it, the terrible poetry of it, made David's chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with his injuries. He spent the next 3 days barely leaving the closet, sat on the floor with radar in his lap. And the cat purred and kneaded and slowly began to look healthier, began to fill out as he ate the food David hand-fed him. And David talked to him, told him everything about the deployments, about the casualties and the fear and the moments when he wanted to give up. And he apologized for the times when he almost broke his promise. Apologized for putting radar through 11 cycles of waiting and worrying in whatever way cats worry. And by the 3rd day, the shredded nest was gone, was cleared away and replaced with nothing. And David understood that this was intentional, that radar was telling him something, was saying that the ritual was over, that there would be no 12th nest because there would be no 12th deployment. And David accepted his medical retirement without hesitation, signed the papers that ended his military career, and he felt relief and grief in equal measure, felt grateful to be alive and guilty for feeling grateful. The years that followed were quiet in ways David had forgotten were possible, were filled with physical therapy and therapy and the slow process of learning how to exist in a world where no one was trying to kill him. And radar was there through all of it, was a constant presence that seemed to understand when David needed silence and when he needed distraction. And David never built another nest, never deployed again. But he thought about those 11 deployments often, thought about the pattern radar had maintained with such faithfulness, and he came to believe, came to accept in a way that had nothing to do with proof and everything to do with faith. That some bonds exist outside the normal rules, that love can create connections that transcend distance and logic, and that his life had been protected not just by his training and his team and his luck, but by a 13-pound orange tabby cat who had somehow stood guard over him from 6,000 miles away. Radar lived to be 19 years old, lived long enough to see David meet someone and fall in love and build a life that had nothing to do with war. And when he finally died peacefully in his sleep on a Saturday morning in spring. David buried him in the backyard with a headstone that read Radar, who kept the promise when I couldn't, and he planted an orange tree above the grave. And every year when it bloomed, he thought about nests and deployments and the mysterious ways that loyalty manifests in creatures we think we understand but never really do. So if this story has moved you, if you've ever experienced a connection with an animal that defied explanation, subscribe to this channel for more stories that explore the invisible threads that bind us. Hit that like button if you believe love transcends species and distance. And leave a comment telling me about a time when an animal in your life showed you something you didn't know was possible. Because these stories matter. These moments of inexplicable connection remind us that the world is stranger and more beautiful than we imagine. And that sometimes the deepest truths are the ones we can't prove, but can only feel. And I'll see you in the next story. Until then, hold close the creatures who choose to love you, because that choice, that loyalty, is the closest thing to magic that exists in this world.